Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Maludumim in Israel. Among the many well-known and overused slogans people have come up with over the centuries is the famous, "A promise is a promise." This slogan, of course, has a few variants that are equally well-known. A deal is a deal, a commitment is a commitment, a contract is a contract. They all mean the same thing, essentially, that once a person has told another person that they will do something, they will stick with what they said. There are supposed to be no ifs, ands, or buts to this. A promise is a promise. But we all know that things don't always work out that way. In fact, they rarely do. We all have trouble meeting our commitments. The reasons are as numerous as there are people and commitments. Things just don't work out the way we expected. We may realize that the commitment was a mistake to begin with, and we look for ways to work around it. Circumstances change, and so do people. But these are the somewhat reasonable excuses. They are honest mistakes or miscalculations, and sometimes things have to be readjusted. But more often than not, the real reason we don't stick to our deals is that we simply can't. We don't have the inner strength to keep our word, or the perseverance to go the distance. The fact is, much of the time, a promise is not a promise. It's just empty words meant to reassure somebody else, if not ourselves. It's a good bet that this is not a particularly new phenomenon. It's certainly as old as the Bible and probably goes back countless millennia before that. This is simply a part of human nature. We make commitments and we may even expect to keep them, but we don't. We learn this form of behavior from our formative years of childhood. Little kids say things all the time to each other or to their parents or siblings. They learn very quickly that these sorts of things are nothing more than methods of communication. Perhaps with maturity, people come to understand that if they want to earn the respect of others, they are expected to keep their word. But as much as that huge application of social pressure moves us to do just that, personal needs and apathy tend to rule the roost. It would be great if things weren't like this. Wouldn't the world be wonderful if we all kept our word always and were able to depend on others and they were able to depend on us? Wouldn't we love it if we were respected as that rare individual who truly could be trusted to stick to their commitments? We would be viewed as something of a saint, that unique person who somehow has mastered this rarest of human traits. This is the type of thing we might want written on our tombstone, the person who truly considered a promise to be a promise. The Bible has its share of promises and commitments, some kept and others dropped. But there is one particular promise that stands out above all others, both in terms of its significance and in terms of its longevity. It was not a human commitment at all, but one made by no less than God. It is stated repeatedly all over the Torah. It was first made to Abraham and then to his son Isaac and to his grandson Jacob. Ultimately became a kind of destiny-defining promise, which encapsulated both the people of Israel and the land of Israel. It was, of course, the promise to give the land of Israel to Abraham and to his descendants. The first appearance of this promise comes in this week's Parsha. The Parsha is called Lech Lecha, which means go for yourself, or something like that. This title refers to Hashem's first communication with Abraham, or Avraham as he was called at the time. Avraham had first appeared in the Torah at the end of last week's Parsha, as the last in the line of direct descendants of Shem, one of the sons of Noah who survived the flood. There is no indication in last week's Parsha that this Avraham was destined for the enormous role that fate would thrust upon him. He was simply another of this long genealogy, who married a woman named Sarai and ultimately left his homeland with his father Terach and his nephew named Lot. The Parsha ends with them being situated in the nondescript town of Haran in the region of ancient Mesopotamia. This week's Parsha takes over at this point and begins with a bang. Hashem, seemingly out of nowhere and for no apparent reason, speaks to Avram with no prior warning, telling him to, quote, go for yourself, or perhaps go on your own. He is told to leave his land, which he was still in, his birthplace, which he had already left, his father's house, of which he was still a member. He was told to go to an unspecified land, described only as which I will show you. Then he is told the dramatic words, quote, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you great. You shall become a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth shall be blessed through you. It's not every day that a person hears something like this, much less from God. This was the great and prescient prophecy declaring Abraham's destiny. Avraham accepted this message, which came to him out of the blue, and he left his entire previous life, heading off in the direction of the ancient land of Canaan. The Torah says that he was 75 years old at the time. He was accompanied by his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, and a somewhat mysterious entourage that came with them. It is unclear in the Torah if the land of Canaan was where God intended him to go, but this is where he ended up. It was upon his arrival in Canaan that the great promise was first made. Quote, I will give this land to your offspring. It's not a particularly noteworthy promise, and it is easily missed in the verses it appears. But there it is, as clear as day. The Parashat then goes on to describe a famine which forced them to head to Egypt, where they went through certain trials and tribulations before returning to Canaan. At that point, Avraham and Lot parted ways, with Lot choosing to live in the valley around the Dead Sea, and Avraham going to the region of the ancient city of Hebron. With this parting of ways, a more dramatic version of this promise is made. Quote, raise your eyes, and from the place where you are, look to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. For all the land that you see, I shall give to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth. If one could count the dust of the earth, that would be the count of your descendants. Arise and walk the length and width of the land, for I shall give it to you. Next comes a war involving various kings of the region, followed by the first covenant between Hashem and Abraham. This covenant, among other things, declared that Abraham's descendants would first have to go through exile before these promises could be fulfilled. But in the end, they would return, and once again, the promise of the land was made. This time, it includes vastly expanded dimensions, going all the way to the Euphrates River and encompassing the territory of no less than 10 nations. After this, Avram's first son, Yishmael, is born to a slave girl whom Avram took as a wife. In a certain incident, this girl, Hagar, is told that her son would also have a great destiny, but one which would be forged with perpetual strife with all whom he would encounter. Nevertheless, he was Avram's son and would share in some of Avram's fate. The Parsha ends with a second covenant, the famous covenant of circumcision. Avram was to commit both himself and his descendants to this ancient rite as a sign of their devotion and pact with God. Avram and Yishmael were the first to fulfill this covenant of circumcision. In the course of instructing Avram about all this, God makes the fateful promise a fourth time. To you and your offspring, I will give the land where you are now living as a foreigner. The whole land of Canaan shall be your eternal heritage. The interesting thing about these promises is they took quite a while to be fulfilled. That predicted exile lasted 430 years in one form or another. While the descendants of Abraham finally returned after the Exodus, they were coming back not to the relatively nondescript land of Canaan, but to the promised land. God kept the promise, even if it took centuries to make good on it. But things get even more interesting after that. Though the Israelites lived on the land for several hundred years, they would ultimately be exiled once again and seemingly driven off into permanent exile. What happened to God's great promise? Was it one more promise that fell short of its ultimate goal? How could this be if the one who promised it was no less than God? But the Judeans, or Jews, the heirs of the Israelites, did return after several decades and built a society that was to last in the land for another several hundred years. Amazingly, this also wasn't the final fulfillment of this promise. The Jews were exiled once again about 2,000 years ago, this time for a much longer period of time. The exile lasted for close to 2,000 years, an impossibly long time in human reckoning. It truly seemed that God's promise would go the way of most promises, partially kept and partially abandoned. Impossible as this sounds, it certainly appeared that God was unable to stick to the terms of the commitment. But then it happened again. After nearly 2,000 years, the Jews came back. They had gone through enormous trials and tribulations, morphing into many different societies over much of the world and going through considerable changes as a religion and as a people. But in the end, the land drew them back like a great magnet. It has been anything but an easy return, but here we are today, living as Israelis in the land of Israel. Who would have believed this possible a century and a half ago? Who would have predicted that things would turn out like this 80 years ago? But this is the way things turned out. It is about as close to a miracle as anything in the entire history of human beings can be said to be. The Jews returned to Israel. God, in the end, kept the great promise. This promise, made 4 times in this Parsha, is one of the great declarations of destiny in human history. It went from fulfillment to abandonment twice, the second taking up almost half the time of recorded human events. But it also went from abandonment to fulfillment twice, the second being the time we are living in today. We live in momentous times with an outrageous biblical promise that seemed to have been thrown to the wayside, coming back in glorious form right before our eyes. A promise is a promise. A commitment is a commitment. A covenant is a covenant. These may be mere words to many of us, but to God, they are destiny. Shabbat Shalom.